In the early 1900s, interest in rocketry and space exploration was growing around the world. In 1903, Russian rocket scientist Konstantin Tsiolkovsky published his article, Exploration of Outer Space by Means of Rocket Devices, notable for being the first time it was suggested a rocket could be used for spaceflight outside the realm of science fiction. By the early 1930s, rocket societies cropped up in the United States, Germany, and Soviet Union. One rocket society in Pasadena, California, became the famed Jet Propulsion Laboratory, responsible for producing and operating some of the most influential American spacecraft in history. Across the pond in London, England, a group of young lads had their sights set on the moon. The British Interplanetary Society formed in 1933 with the goal of, quote, the stimulation of public interest in the possibility of interplanetary travel, and the conducting of practical research in connection with such problems, unquote. It is the world's oldest existing space advocacy organization. 3 that preceded it, one in the US, one in Germany, and one in the Soviet Union, no longer exist in their original capacities. Society members wanted a project that would popularize the concept of interplanetary travel while simultaneously proving the young organization could be trusted with legitimate scientific research. They chose space travel over more concrete and practical ideas, such as a rocket-powered car, for 2 reasons. First, they were forbidden by Britain's Explosives Act of 1875 from shooting off real rockets for no reason. Second, and something much more relatable 100 years later, they were broke. Members were teenagers and young adults who did not have money for expensive equipment. As Society member and science fiction author Arthur C. Clarke put it, quote, we were in the position of someone who couldn't afford a car, but had enough for the speedometer and the rearview mirror, unquote. Therefore, the group was limited to a paper-bound design study that did not cost money or need equipment, but could be as complex as they pleased. In 1937, the Society's technical committee set out to develop the world's first detailed study of a manned lunar mission. It is important to note they were not the first to consider the technical requirements of flying to the moon. Rocket pioneers Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, Hermann Oberth, and Robert Goddard beat them to it. The latter first suggested a rocket could be sent to the moon in 1919, 7 years before he would launch the world's first liquid-fueled rocket. The Society's proposal was more extensive and outlined the various challenges relating to both the vehicle and its crew. The technical committee consisted of about a dozen members and was headed by engineer J. Happy Edwards. Clarke was the astronomer of the group, and according to Smithsonian Magazine, quote, filled sketchbooks with drawings of lunar craters seen through a homemade telescope, unquote. The group included draftsman H. Bramall, aircraft engineer Val Cleaver, mathematician M. K. Hansen, Viennese chemist Arthur Janser, biologist S. Clementiski, electrical engineer Harold E. Ross, and artist and engineer Ralph A. Smith. Smith was Edward's childhood friend and made his living designing the interiors of London cinemas and hotels. He illustrated many of the Society's concepts. His son Ashton, who later worked on the Apollo program, called the group, quote, the most unusual bunch of people you could expect to run across, unquote. Committee meetings were held in Smith's living room, but sometimes found their way to the pub. Despite being science fiction fans themselves, the committee did its best to avoid sci-fi concepts and cliches the English population was already exposed to, thanks to H.G. Wells and Edgar Rice Burroughs. They used only principles that had been developed by the rocketeers, engineers, and scientists before them. The technical committee published a paper detailing the results of their lunar spaceship study in the summer of 1939. The study determined a single-stage launch vehicle was not feasible, as, quote, 99% or more of its initial liftoff mass would have to consist of propellant, unquote. Instead, the rocket consisted of 6 stages, which they called steps, the final of which was a gumdrop-shaped lunar lander. Each step would be smaller in size to the previous and discarded once it burned through its fuel, what we today call staging. The first multi-stage rockets were developed and used in the late Yuan/early Ming dynasties in China. And using multi-stage rockets for high-altitude flight and space exploration was proposed in the early 20th century by Goddard and Tsiolkovsky. At the time, only solid fuel rockets were available in Britain, so the paper proposed hundreds of solid rocket motors bundled together like sticks of dynamite in the shape of a hexagon. The lower 5 steps made up the launch vehicle and had 168 motors apiece. The final step had 45 medium motors and 1,200 smaller tubes for lunar descent, ascent, and return to Earth. The entire vehicle had a total of 2,250 motors. This design allowed the motors to be mass-produced, reducing the overall cost of the rocket. According to the British Interplanetary Society, the committee, quote, considered that the development of rocket motors for their proposed lunar mission would have to proceed in stages, beginning with literature and experimental studies of possible propellants, followed by the designs of chambers and nozzles on the best theoretical basis, unquote. They also constructed a basic test stand for static proving firings. The hexagonal booster had a height of 32 meters, or 105 feet, and a diameter of 6 meters, or 19.7 feet, as well as a weight of 1,000 tons and a payload to lunar surface capacity of 1 ton. For comparison, the American Gemini Titan II was 33 meters in length, 3 meters in diameter, and had a payload to LEO capacity of 3.6 tons. Using solid fuel proved to be the most impractical feature of the moon rocket concept. Most rocketeers, even back then, preferred liquid fuels, like the 18-year-old Eric Burgess, who led an affiliated astronautical society in Manchester and was designing his own moon rocket using petrol and liquid oxygen. Burgess would go on to write for NASA and gave planetary scientist Carl Sagan the idea for the Pioneer plaques, the pictorial messages on board the Pioneer 10 and 11 deep space probes. According to Arthur C. Clarke, no one in the technical committee imagined the development of pumps that could handle the amount of fuel that burned every second during launch. However, less than 1,000 miles away, a well-funded German team led by Wernher von Braun was close to solving that very problem. The gumdrop-shaped lunar lander did not physically resemble lunar excursion module proposals from the 1960s, and would deliver a crew of 3 to the lunar surface for a 14-day stay. Its pressurized cabin was similar to that of the Apollo command module, and its landing gear was similar to that of the Apollo lunar module. Since the physiological effects of weightlessness were still unknown at the time, the spacecraft would have rotated around its major axis to create artificial gravity while traversing space. In the cockpit, quote, the controls for firing are placed on the arms of the chairs, and the chairs themselves move on rails round the life compartment. The crew reclines on these chairs with their heads towards the center of the ship, and a circular catwalk is provided for them around the circumference of the chamber, unquote. Instruments included an accelerometer, altimeter, chronometer, gyroscope, and speedometer. Quote, a suspended pendulum provides indication of quote-unquote wobble, and modified sextants and rangefinders are used to determine position. These instruments are placed in convenient juxtaposition to the crew, unquote. Edwards also invented the first instrument designed specifically for space travel, the coleostat. The periscope-like device uses 2 mirrors to make stars appear stationary while the spacecraft is in rotation for artificial gravity generation. Instead of constructing a launch pad, the moonship would have launched from a floating platform in a body of water near the equator. The rocket would be inside a partially submerged caisson, a watertight chamber usually used in construction work underwater. Only the 6th stage would make the journey to the moon and back, landing, lifting off, and re-entering in one piece. This method of landing on the moon is called lunar direct descent, and does not involve assembling the vehicle in low Earth orbit or carrying a separate landing vehicle. This was the original favored landing method for the Apollo program, but was not possible with the technology of the time. To return to Earth, the lander would use aerobraking and a parachute to descend through the atmosphere into the surface. The mooncraft would be protected by a sort of payload fairing during launch, but lack protection during descent through Earth's atmosphere. Quote, the segmented carapace is, of course, discarded after passing out of Earth's atmosphere, and protection of the life compartment shell is not needed for the ascent from the moon. The return into Earth's atmosphere will be done at low velocities, hence heating of this shell will not be excessive, unquote. The first British Interplanetary Society spacesuit would not be designed until 1949, but the original lunar suit would have been made of rubber or leather and include flat shoes and dark goggles. Equipment for the lunar voyage included balsa wood pencils, charts and books printed on rice paper, geological hammers, spades, a telescope, a microscope, sunburn lotion for working in the sun, and a canvas tent to place over the lander to reduce internal temperature. All the oxygen and water the crew and spacecraft needed would come from a single tank of liquid hydrogen peroxide. The food chosen had a high energy content: bread and butter, cheese, porridge, honey, ham, salmon, and raisins. The drink of choice was cocoa because it was water-based and could be mixed with coffee to keep the crew awake during their long hours. While on the surface, the crew would communicate with Earth using flashes of light. Though the Society's lunar mission was never meant to take flight, the biggest problems it faced, as space projects of future decades would face, were lack of time, money, and manpower. The group's initial prediction of launch in 15 years was not feasible in an era where the notion of space travel itself was considered crazy. According to Society member Leonard Carter, discussion of lunar travel prior to World War II, quote, was regarded as a form of lunacy, and not a mild one at that, unquote. In early 1939, the lunar spaceship design received a bit of publicity from magazines and publications, including Time, that circulated as far away as British-occupied India. Unfortunately, in September 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland, and Britain declared war on Germany. British men were encouraged to take up arms, and the Society was temporarily dissolved. When the Society reformed after the war, its members were more mature and numerous. Their concepts for rockets and space travel were no longer whimsical, almost juvenile ideas after witnessing the devastating power of the German V-2 rocket. Immediately after the end of the war in Europe in spring 1945, the United States and the United Kingdom, but mostly the UK, conducted Operation Backfire, during which British personnel captured V-2 rocket technology from abandoned German factories. The handling and launch procedures were carried out by German personnel, and 3 vehicles were launched near Cuxhaven in the British occupation zone. The British Interplanetary Society found out about these launches and initiated the Mega-Rock program, aimed to develop a suborbital, man-rated derivative of the V-2 using technology and information collected during Operation Backfire. Mega-Rock had a lot in common with the future Mercury Redstone launch vehicle in its flight profile, which makes sense, since the Mercury Redstone was derived from the U.S. Army Redstone missile, which was a direct descendant of the V-2 rocket. The Mega-Rock proposal was rejected in favor of developing technology with more direct and tangible military usage, namely nuclear capability. Longtime Technical Committee member Ralph Smith's August 1947 article, Landing on an Airless World, accurately outlined the procedures of landing on the moon the Apollo lunar module would later use. He wrote and illustrated the book, The Exploration of the Moon, that same year. In November 1949, Harry Ross presented the first serious scientific study of a lunar spacesuit, with art by Ralph Smith. The suit would have weighed 68 kilograms, or 150 pounds, on Earth, or 11 kilograms or 25 pounds on the Moon, and allowed for 12 hours of activity on the lunar surface, withstanding temperatures between 120 degrees Celsius to minus 150 degrees Celsius, or 248 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 238 degrees Fahrenheit. The suit would have consisted of 4 layers. The innermost would be of moisture-wicking material, quote, for comfort and to manage contact between the rubber and skin, unquote. The next layer would be an airtight rubber sheath, followed by a 1 centimeter thick layer of quote-unquote cellular heat-resisting material, such as kapuk or wool. The suit's exterior was to be a smooth, quote, highly burnished metallic film designed to reflect as much heat as possible, unquote. The chest and thigh areas would have been matte black, and a silver cape was included for temperature regulation and aeroforming. As stated by the National Space Center, quote, the suit design includes an airlock in the chest. This would have allowed the wearer to put objects, for example moon rock samples, through the outer door and then retrieve them through the inner door once the outer door had been resealed. In order to do so, the wearer needed to retract their arms from their sleeves, allowing them to work inside the suit in the bulbous chest area, unquote. According to the Society, the suit's helmet, quote, was to be a light, rigid double-shell structure, with the inner a bright alloy metal and the outer a plastic with burnished metal coating, unquote. It included a narrow slit for viewing and a pull-down visor for sun protection. The boots had 4 centimeter thick asbestos soles, remember this was the 1940s, and treads that resembled cleats. Other suit features included shoulder pads for chafing prevention, mitts to be worn over the suit's gloves for handling hot or cold samples and tools, and detachable knee pads for comfort while crawling or kneeling. The astronaut would breathe pure oxygen, and the suit would be cooled by liquid with a low boiling point, such as ammonia or water. Ross and Smith did not specify how the spacesuit would deal with excretory system waste. Communications would be via a radio antenna on top of the suit's backpack, a headset, and a laryngophone, or a throat microphone. In 1951, the Society held a conference to plan the world's first artificial satellite, 4 years before the United States' announcement of their intention to launch quote-unquote small Earth-circling satellites between 1957 and 1958. A few of the original members continued refining the old lunar ship and incorporated newly developed German technology into it. The end product was much closer to what NASA would launch in the late 1960s. Arthur C. Clarke predicted the invention of the geostationary communication satellite in 1945 and rose to international fame as one of the big three of science fiction, alongside American authors Isaac Asimov and Robert Heinlein. In the mid-1960s, he co-wrote the screenplay for the 1968 sci-fi epic 2001: A Space Odyssey, one of the most influential films ever made. In July 1969, 30 years to the month of the British Interplanetary Society publishing their study of a manned lunar mission, Clarke sat next to Walter Cronkite of CBS and retired astronaut Wally Schirra as a commentator on the first manned moon landing. Britain's first official space program began in 1952, with its first satellite program, Ariel, beginning in 1959. 6 aerial satellites were built by the US and UK and launched on American rockets. The first and only native British satellite, Prospero, was put into orbit by the first and only native British rocket, Black Arrow, in 1971. Called, quote, one of the classical pioneering studies in the history of astronautics, unquote, by the contemporary British Interplanetary Society, the 1930s Lunar Spaceship proposal was the world's first detailed plan for landing men on the moon. Many of the concepts introduced in their report were later used by the Apollo program, such as launching a multi-stage rocket and using a parachute to slow the spacecraft down during descent to Earth. The proposal was about 2 decades ahead of its time, though, and the common man did not take rocketry seriously until after World War II. While the Society's moonship is now remembered as a very minute piece of space history from an era when space travel was purely science fiction, it is nonetheless one of the small steps taken in preparation for man's exploration of our home planet's closest neighbor. To quote Clarke, "We stand now at the turning point between 2 eras. Behind us is a past to which we can never return. The coming of the rocket brought to an end 1,000,000 years of isolation. The childhood of our race was over, and history as we know it began." Thank you so much for watching till the end of this video, and I hope you learned something new. As always, the link to the corresponding web article is in the description, and if you want more space history, hit subscribe, and I'll see you next time. I've been Erin, and you've been watching Spaceflight Histories.